At the Rocket Conference, I asked the audience, which of course many of you were there, do you accept the idea that the future of managing websites is iterative, including technical and design and content and so on? And unanimously, everybody said yes. And then I asked the question, well, how many of you are there yet? And I don't think anybody put their hand up. Afterwards, somebody came up and said, well, I think we are there, I just didn't want to tell anyone. So could you put your hands up if you believe that you're in the state where you are iteratively improving your website? Okay, 3, excellent, okay. So I'm going to focus on that idea from a particular angle, and it includes that question of prioritization. And I think, obviously, there's a few of you who are already on this journey, but I think what I'm doing is really driving home some of the themes we've already talked about throughout the day in terms of speaking to your audience, understanding them. But I'm going to bring into the mix the questions around leadership and strategic objectives as well, and wrap those up into a single role that I'm going to describe to you in a moment. So thinking differently about websites, making prioritization much easier. And like I said, I'm going to focus on websites. This does apply across digital, generally, in terms of all the different tools and techniques, but I think most of us in the room have such large websites it's worth focusing on for this. So if we start thinking about websites differently, how would we need to change as individuals? And hopefully, throughout this talk, I'm going to convince you that your website is not a channel. It's certainly not a shop window, and that's one I hear quite frequently. If anything, your website's the entire shop. But it's not just a shop window, and it's not a project, and I think that's quite important. As somebody who was a project manager working on websites, I think it's quite interesting. So your website is a product. And I think that's the main thing I want to get across. That's not a suggestion, that's what it is. Your website is a product. And the question then is, how good are your product management skills? So this is the structure. I'm going to talk about the status quo. I'm going to give an unfair summary of how your typical website is run. It's a caricature. It's not actually true for everyone. Then we're going to look at the discipline of product management and how that actually applies to websites. And then look at the toolbox available to product managers and some of the ways we can prioritize requirements as part of managing that website product. So looking at the status quo, day-to-day fixing issues, perhaps we could term that firefighting, responding to internal stakeholder requests as best we can, and then perhaps over time observe that the quality of the site is degrading, getting that nagging sense that, okay, something needs to change, make the case for a new one. So start a project. I made that sound very simple, but obviously that can take some time. And then just 18 to 24 months later, you have a new website. Anyone think I'm exaggerating with that time scale? No? Okay. But once that new website's live, you haven't really solved the underlying issue. In 6 months, I would argue that site will start to go stale again. Your website will always be an expression of the culture and processes that produce it. Your website will always be an expression of the culture and processes that produce it. And yes, that is quoting myself there. Feel free to tweet that. But I believe the answer to this is product management skills. And I think it's interesting looking at perhaps the cause as to why we don't think in terms of product when we look at a website. So let's look at the discipline of product management, a definition of a product here. So a product is a good or service that most closely meets the requirements of a particular market and yields enough profit to justify its continued existence. So I think when we reflect on websites, we can see, well, okay, yeah, there is an audience, there is a market, there's needs and wants that we're satisfying with this website, this product, and yields enough profit to justify its continued existence. Well, actually, yeah, your organization is plowing a huge amount of money into this website. Does it justify its continued existence? Well, I don't think there's many conversations where we say, okay, it's not making a profit, let's close this down. That would be an interesting conversation. But in terms of profit, it isn't just sort of money. It could also be reputation, or it could be to change people's minds as well, some sort of education, persuasion, those sorts of things. Different sorts of profit for the organization to justify it. So let's look at the marketing mix. So most of you will be aware of the 4 Ps, product, price, place, and promotion. And I have this pet theory that in marketing teams, in many marketing teams that I've worked with, the first 3 of those Ps are actually dictated to them. So actually, when you often hear people talk about marketing, they think about the term promotion. They actually use marketing and promotion synonymously, but the discipline of marketing theory, covers all of this. So if marketing teams are spending their time understanding what the product is in order to position it correctly to an audience, they naturally will then, when they own a website, will think in terms of another channel as a form of promotion. Now, that's something that we've observed is that marketing teams, obviously, over recent years are taking over websites, and that makes sense in many ways. But it's really this question of the product side that I'm interested in and the product management skill. So let's look at the role of product managers. We'll look at how they spend their time and how it fits into the bigger picture when it comes to managing websites. So a product manager will gather requirements, and traditionally, when we gather requirements, we might talk to as many people as possible, cast the net wide. And that makes sense, we're talking to colleagues, people who have domain expertise. And then we also might look at what's wrong today and respond to that in our requirements building. Obviously, that has the downside of not being thinking about the future. It's actually thinking about perhaps even the past. But that is important, obviously, to assess issues. And then looking at competitors, and that can be useful for ideas. Again, that has the downside where really if you copy competitors too closely, you're also making the assumption that you're strategically aligned, that you're going to the same place. And that may not be the case. But this is fine, and this is the way often requirements get gathered, and that's natural. But I'd like to make the point that the key sources for requirements gathering should be the leadership and the customer. And incidentally, those are the 2 hardest ones to really get to see and talk to. They just require that extra bit of effort. But I see the product managers bringing those 2 together in terms of bringing something that serves both audiences and brings those aims together. So I've created a model. Now, every model is imperfect, but I'm sure there'll be issues with it. But really, what I'm trying to do here is just illustrate a particular point in the role of product manager and how they work. So you have the leadership and you have the customers. And the product manager talks to both. And then in the middle, you have the team, the delivery team. And if you think about it in terms of what the product manager is doing there, they are wrapping around. They're dealing with the slightly fluffier sides of both ends of the equation. And so in terms of the leadership side, they'll be understanding in detail the corporate strategy and why that has been put in place. But their job is also then to translate to the team in terms of objectives. In terms of customers, understanding the fluffy stuff around that, in terms of motives, jobs to be done, understanding perhaps those more in-depth stakeholder interviews and those sorts of things. And then the team, perhaps more further down the line, talk about user experience research and testing and those sorts of things in a bit more detail, but once the scope's been narrowed slightly. That's not to say the team can't get involved with the leadership and customers, but it's really the responsibility of the product manager to make sure that at least they've done those things. And then to bring it together, you can talk in terms of user stories. Okay, so a product manager. How does a product manager spend their time when we're talking about the web particularly? Well, meet the customer. Meet the customer. And meet the customer. Okay, well, there's options, but you can meet the customer or learn the flute, up to you. But anyway, compare what customers are saying with what they're doing. I think we heard that in the talk just now with Ben. And it's so true. you can do interviews, you can do research, and people will tell you things, almost what you want to hear or what they want you to hear. But look at actually what they're doing, and look at the user testing that's going on, get involved in that, and also understand the analytics as well. And then when we talked about the leadership, meet with the leadership. Explain to the leadership that digital isn't just technology, it's not something that somebody else does. It's actually like a vital ingredient that, like money and strategy, is something that achieves an objective. It helps us get there. It's not a thing that somebody else does. I'm thinking, obviously, communication. I think it's something we've heard throughout the day is the importance of communicating this. Communicate internally, explain your priorities. We'll come on to that later in terms of the prioritization of things, about what's coming up. And present to as many people as you can. But in the way you do this, it really helps build a case for what you're doing. If you're communicating why you're doing things, it builds rapport, it builds trust in your process. And people rely on you to make decisions then at that point when they understand your thinking and why. And so it should make it less of a bun fight when it comes to trying to battle requirements between different stakeholders, because they understand you've got a process. Hopefully they're educated about your roadmap and what you're doing, and so the arguments should be fewer or at least shorter. So you might be thinking, okay, that's very well, John, thanks, but have you seen my working life? Do you know what it is I have to deal with? This is a bit idealistic. Is that the case? Is anybody skeptical at this point? Yep, some nods. Okay, good. That's what I was expecting. So I've had a stab at overcoming objections without hearing them. But I've got 4 here. So talking in terms of buy-in to actually get this sort of process off the ground, skill sets, budget, and, of course, time. So when thinking about buy-in, well, what I've said is you should be speaking to the leadership regularly. So sitting down, if you're talking in terms of those big bang projects that happen every 2-3 years, perhaps the way of communicating with senior stakeholders is quite formal. It might be done as a project charter or project initiation document that everyone's expected to read, and it's infrequent, and you've got quite a hill to climb in terms of convincing people about what you're trying to do. But if you meet with people every month face-to-face, talk in terms of their strategic priorities, which obviously that's their job. Their job is to deliver strategic priorities, and what you're doing is saying, I'm going to help you achieve that. And so hopefully they'll listen at that point. I say hopefully. But what you're doing is meeting people regularly, and so buy-in should occur from that, rather than trying to get them to care about something that they don't think about that frequently. Think about skills. Well, you might be thinking, okay, I just don't have that skill set in my team, or obviously look at yourself as well. We should all do that first. But what these skills are talking about in terms of thinking more iteratively, perhaps talking about releasing every few weeks rather than every few months or years, major updates and so on. Think that actually it's just a different way of looking at things. It does take a bit of time to get to grips with the mentality and the culture, as Ben was saying earlier, but these aren't skills that are unattainable. And so actually write down the skills that you need and then consider whether people that you already have, including yourself, can be trained up in these. If you do have the budget, obviously you could go outside or hire people in. But then think about budget. This is an interesting question. Potentially what I'm proposing here might have a higher business as usual cost, because we're talking about updates regularly, more communication and those sorts of things. But actually, when you have fewer big bang projects, what you're actually doing is saving the cost of those monolithic projects that actually pause some of those key requirements that you have until those projects are live. I think it's quite important. I mean, you can talk in terms of opportunity cost or economic profit lost and those sorts of things. So if you have a key feature that's going to improve conversions on your site that is tied to revenue, for instance, by delaying for 18 months, you've lost all of that opportunity. So by thinking more iteratively, getting those features out more quickly, that makes the budget question much easier to answer. And then thinking in terms of time. Now, I like to think in terms of priorities rather than time. That's a bit irritating to people sometimes when they talk to me about time and the lack of it. But if you look at your diary for the next couple of weeks and see the way you've allocated your time, that should tell you where your priorities lie. And actually then compare that with the endeavor of actually making your website more effective for your organization, and hopefully you see where the winner is. So let's look at a few of the tools and processes for the product manager. User stories. I imagine most of you have come across user stories. I will cover it very quickly, just for those who aren't familiar or need a brush up. So I love user stories because it's great in the terms that the business users can understand them easily, and it leaves the subject matter experts of the creative or technical team to deliver solutions free of constraints because they're trying to achieve an end goal. So here's a user story. As a user type C, I need to register online for training course X, whether I'm at my desk or mobile. So as you see there, there's no detailed specification or requirements, and the team is free to achieve that aim in whatever way they see fit. So I've had a bit of fun in creating a poor version. So users should be able to complete online registration for course X using a large drop-down menu available on every page in the training section, and the data should be stored as a JSON object and must use asymmetric encryption. Now, that's not going to make sense to a lot of people internally when you put that round. It depends on your organization, but most of the time, they'd struggle. And so in terms of writing user stories, it's a format that's quite formulaic, but it's also a way of characterizing your objective, what you're trying to do. So once we gather requirements as user stories, we can look at prioritization again. And I'm going to just cover a few areas to consider which are quite obvious in many ways. But actually what I'm saying here is you need to formally consider each of these, and it's very easy just to jump to one or the other. So I'm going to label this point, strategic priorities and objectives. These often get put in that early document that says, okay, this is why we're doing something. But then you roll forward 6 months and everyone's lost in the weeds of different technologies and integrations and data and so on. And those strategic priorities can get lost. But if we're talking about reviewing our priorities every week or every 3 weeks, and this is something we make an effort to do, and we're also talking to senior stakeholders regularly who care about this stuff, at that point it becomes very hard to forget about them because they'll be asking, okay, you said you're going to help me achieve my strategic objective with this digital program you're doing. Have you done it yet? Audience pain points. So what's stopping them from getting their job done? What is it that they're trying to achieve? What barriers are in the way? And again, that could be something that's very simple. And so putting that up the priority list might make a lot of sense. Technical improvements. I think this is a bit of a hidden issue at times, but I think it's very, very important. If we're talking about more regular releases of something, and we consider this with Contentus as a product when we're releasing it, is to make underlying technical improvements with every release. Because if you don't, eventually you build up technical debt. And at some point, people say, yeah, we'd like to do that, but we can't because the technology is so out of date. At which point, yeah, you get a big bang project where you rip everything out and start again. And so doing the unglamorous work of regular, iterative technical improvements makes a lot of sense long term, but it's hard when you've got people shouting for things internally in the short term. And then consider which user stories need perhaps relatively few resources to achieve, and then when you compare them with the outcomes that you've got, that might be numerous. Now, I'm deliberately avoiding the word leveraging here, Zach. Hope you note that, thank you. But it could be as simple as making a call to action more prominent that's very important to your audience or to achieve something, or reducing the complexity of a form. So those are very simple things that might take half an hour to achieve, and yet they have a disproportionate benefit in terms of the outcome. So those are things that should go up your list of priorities. How many people in here have heard of the Kano model? I hope you do, good. Yeah, okay. People in the consensus product team, great. That makes sense. But this is really good for, the Kano model is a Japanese model that helps us bounce ideas off each other, bounce different requirements off each other. And it's very simple. It has two axes. So one is customer satisfaction, and the other is sort of level of effort or investment required to achieve that goal. And the real power comes from putting your user stories or your requirements on this and plotting them against these three lines here. So you've got your delighters, which some people might term wow factor or whatever, in terms of making people, something you might tell your mum about when you see it. And then, well, I do. Okay, and then you've got your satisfiers. I'll give an example of that in a moment. And then basic expectations, which is something that if you don't do it, people are just going to be turned off straight away and will leave. So an example of a basic expectation, content is well written. That could be a basic expectation. That you go onto a website, you expect content to be well written. Now, that's a huge amount of investment, as you can see on that line. But doing it forever isn't necessarily going to create the wow factor, and it's very important to make that distinction. Now, I'm not arguing at all. You can get away without doing this, looking at Zach again, because it's a basic expectation. If your content is not well written, people will instantly discredit you and just think you're not a serious organization to work with. But it has to be there. Satisfiers. So an example of this in terms of a website might be to answer every possible question that user has. They might be satisfied with that, but again, they're not going to write home about it. But that's quite a lot of effort as well. And then a delighter might be to answer somebody's question before they've even had it in their own mind. And so sometimes, delighters don't always take a lot of effort, but they might, but it's making sure that they're in there. If you have to sacrifice any when you're trying to make difficult decisions between features, probably satisfiers might drop down the list because you have to make difficult choices sometimes. Making sure there's a delighter in there and the basic expectations, which I would say include underlying technical enhancements, making sure they're in there. But one last point before we move on from the Kano model is to say that the delighters eventually become basic expectations. So you might put some in, but don't sit back and relax thinking that that's going to be there forever as a delighter for people. So it is difficult with prioritization. Requirements don't always compare with each other. They're completely different to each other. But if you look at all of the user stories you've got and look at those through those different lenses I've described, including the Kano model, winners do emerge. And when you have that discussion internally with people about, okay, this is why we've prioritized this, you've got, obviously, you're working with customers. We've talked about user research today, which is very important. You can talk in terms of strategic priorities and why you're doing something. And you can also put the Kano model in front of people as well. It's quite easy to explain. So just a quick look at roadmap, what a roadmap might look like. I've borrowed this from the Scrum Alliance. If you zoom in, you can see what we call epics, those big blocks at the top going down, and then user stories grouped into those. And so they could be perhaps a particular feature or an integration, or it could be that they are a user journey that you're working on. And you can see each sprint, which might be 2 or 3 weeks, something like that, works and delivers those user stories. But they must be complete at the end of each sprint. So every few sprints, you might then decide to do a release. And we're talking about very sort of short periods of time here. It might be 6 weeks you do a release, or even shorter over time. And you package up those features you've built and release those. So I'm talking obviously about the agile methodology here. One thing you can do is you can create version numbers of your releases if we're thinking in terms of product. And it makes it an easier conversation. If somebody comes to you begging for a feature to be released, and you say, well, okay, that didn't make it in 2.2, but 2.4 is when it's coming out, then that's a slightly easier conversation to have, particularly if you can show evidence that you've moved along and released features when you said you would. But if you have those big bang projects and they've asked for a feature to be put into the mix, and you say no, then in their minds are thinking, I've got another 3 years to wait for the next opportunity, so they'll fight much harder to get it in now. So with shorter release cycles, you get value more quickly to your market, your audience. So web product management, well, it's making things better steadily, It lacks perhaps the glory of the Big Bang project, but it also lacks the risk of that as well. And often Big Bang projects have everything lumped in, including content revisions, underlying technical improvements, branding reviews, all of those things. And they become so unwieldy that by the time you get to the go live, everyone's exhausted rather than ecstatic. And we're talking about a more steady way of working here and more valuable as well. And long term, the glory as a product manager is all yours because you're the one bringing it all together and communicating with everybody. So prioritization is difficult, as I said, but it is easier to prioritize for the next 3 weeks than it is to prioritize for the next 3 years. And prioritization does make money, it saves time, and it keeps focus. Thank you.